Parts are not the same as mine in this video. You can still follow along and build your PC because the process is exactly the same. But if you like the look of this system and you want to copy it, I'll drop a link to the parts down below so you guys can pick it up. Okay, so now we are ready to build a PC. Grab your CPU box, motherboard, memory, and storage to start off. Open your motherboard box and take out the motherboard and remove it from its anti-static bag and place it right on the box. Don't take out anything else from the box just yet. Keep it in there for now until we need it later. Now you're ready to install the CPU. So click on the correct timestamp of the CPU that you're installing so you can skip to that section of the video. The only options right now are Intel or AMD. By the way, you can tell what socket your CPU is using by simply looking at the product box. It's always labeled on there.
Gak usah takut, kan ada Agoda. Agoda. Bisa liburan murah di banyak hotel. Wah, diskonnya sampai 60%. Cuma di Agoda, booking sekarang.
Okay, so you're installing an Intel CPU. Intel CPUs don't have any pins underneath the chip, so it's easier to install. Instead, the pins are located in the motherboard socket, just like the new AM5 platform from AMD. You have two options here. You can either install the CPU how it is directly onto the motherboard socket, or you can use a contact frame, which helps improve the contact between the cooler and the CPU, which will lower your CPU temps. Either way, I'll show you guys how to do both. To install the CPU normally, take the CPU out of its plastic cover, making sure not to touch the top or bottom of the CPU. Handle it very carefully from the sides only. Locate the tiny triangle in the corner of the CPU. After that, go ahead and locate the other small triangle on the corner of the motherboard socket because that will determine how we install the CPU. The same triangle can be found etched onto the motherboard's PCB. After locating both triangles, align the CPU so that both triangles are in the same direction. Using your other hand, press down on the latch next to the socket to release the tension and flip over the cover. Begin to gently lower the CPU onto the socket and watch it fall in place. Whatever you do, do not apply any force as you can damage the pins underneath. After that, you can gently tap it from the side just to make sure that it's fully seated. You can easily tell by looking at it from the side, and you can also tell if the CPU is fully seated by the notches on the CPU itself. Afterwards, slowly lower the latch and feed it underneath the hook to lock the CPU in place. It's okay if it feels a little stiff. That's completely normal. Don't freak out. The black plastic cover will also pop right off. But if it doesn't, simply remove it from the cover. If you're installing a retention bracket, this is how you do it. Otherwise, you can skip to the next part, which is memory. Installing a retention bracket will help with lowering your CPU temps, but it might void your warranty, so proceed with caution. Contact frames exist for both AM5 and LGA 1700 sockets, but I'll show you guys the Intel version since we are installing an Intel CPU right now. The contact frame always comes with a tool which is needed to remove the 4 screws holding down the retention bracket on your motherboard. So use the tool and gently loosen all 4 of the screws until you can lift and remove the stock retention bracket. After that, you can follow the same steps as before to install the CPU. After the CPU is fully seated, carefully lower the contact frame by aligning all 4 holes together and simply screw it in one by one in a crisscross pattern until it's nice and snug. Okay, so we are installing an AMD CPU on the AM4 socket. This means the pins are located behind the CPU, so we have to be extra careful with handling it. First, make sure to inspect the pins to make sure that nothing is bent. Then go ahead and locate the tiny triangle in the corner of the CPU and find that exact same triangle on the CPU socket because we have to match both triangles together. Using your other hand to simply lift open the lever, slowly lower the CPU with the pins facing down. Make sure you're holding the CPU from its sides. Do not apply any force on top of the CPU because you can easily bend the pins. It should naturally just fall in place. If it doesn't, feel free to wiggle it a little bit so that it does. After the CPU is fully seated, you can slowly lower the lever back down and lock the CPU in place. Okay, so we're installing an AMD CPU on the AM5 socket. In this situation, the pins are on the motherboard socket instead of underneath the CPU. Go ahead and locate the triangle on the CPU itself and find that exact same triangle on the CPU socket cover because we are going to align both of them together. Carefully press and move the lever away, releasing the tension of the bracket, and open the cover. While you're holding the CPU on its sides, gently lower it down onto the socket. Make sure not to apply any pressure or force the CPU down, as it can damage the pins on the motherboard. After the CPU is fully seated, you can slowly lower the lever back down and lock the CPU in place. The protective cover should pop right off, but if it doesn't, you can simply remove it yourself. Now, if you're installing a contact frame for AM5, then listen up. If not, you can skip over to the next section. First, release the retention bracket and use the tool to gently loosen all 4 of the screws until you can lift and remove the entire bracket. After that, follow the same steps as listed before to install the CPU carefully. Once the CPU is fully seated, place the contact frame over the CPU and tighten it with the provided tool and the included screws. Do not use the old screws because they are a different size. Okay, so you are one of the very few elite out there to buy a Threadripper CPU. Let's get this baby installed. Obviously, you will need the CPU itself, but you'll also need the install tool that it comes with. It has an orange handle, so you can't miss it. Take your time to gently open the Threadripper box and slide out the CPU. I want you to enjoy this process because it is a very joyous occasion. Make sure not to touch the surface of the CPU or the bottom. Always grab the CPU from the sides. Notice there are numbers on the socket. It indicates the order of opening and closing the socket. So to open the socket, we will have to loosen the screws in this exact order: 3, 2, and 1. Okay, we are now ready to install the CPU. Grab the torque driver and start loosening up the socket in the order indicated. We're going to start from 3, then move over to 2, and finally socket number 1. The socket will spring open, so don't freak out. Go ahead and grab both of the blue tabs on the top and pull them up. We're also going to remove the gray protective piece that's on the socket. Now this part is a little tricky. You have to gently slide in the CPU against the rails, but make sure to do it slowly so that it doesn't derail and pop off the bracket. Here's another angle of the installation. We are starting from the top and slowly sliding the CPU down against the rail. Once the CPU is safely on the bottom, we are ready to lower the CPU down onto the socket. While you're holding down on the blue tabs, lower the entire CPU down until you hear it click. Then we can lower the top bracket. And as you're holding it down, we can tighten the bracket in place by going backwards. Remember, we did 3, 2, 1 to open it. Now we're doing 1, 2, 3 to lock it. Make sure to tighten each screw all the way until you hear the tool click. Don't be afraid to use some force until you hear the click. That's it, you officially installed a Threadripper CPU. Congrats. Pretty easy so far, right? Now it's time to install the memory. Most mainstream boards have either 2 or 4 DIMM slots. If you're installing 4 sticks, then you just have to simply fill up all 4 slots in any order. It does not matter. But if you're installing only 2, then you have to use the correct slots to take advantage of dual channel. Most motherboards will have a diagram stating which slots to install first. You can also find that in your motherboard's manual, but typically you want to put the memory sticks in slots A2 and B2. If you're looking at the motherboard directly, it's going to be the 2nd and 4th DIMM slots. If you're installing only 1 stick of RAM, then it doesn't matter where you put it, but I do recommend using the A2 slot. Using your pleasure finger, gently open the tabs on each corresponding DIMM slot. Some motherboards have 1 tab on each slot, and some others have 2. After all the tabs are open, locate and find the gap on your memory stick, because we're going to be aligning that with the notch on the DIMM slot. Using both of your hands, gently lower the RAM sticks evenly so that the groove on the sticks aligns with the notch on the slot. And then proceed to push down on both sides of the memory stick evenly until it snaps in place. If you did this correctly, the latches will completely close. If they didn't close, then press down on the stick until it's fully seated. You should hear a click. If you have 2 sticks, then do the same thing for the 2nd memory stick, but in the B2 slot. Okay, so now we're ready to install the storage devices. I will show you guys how to install an M.2 SSD, a traditional 2.5-inch SSD, and a hard drive. But for now, we are only doing an M.2 SSD. If you're not installing an M.2 SSD, feel free to skip over to the next section. If you guys are installing multiple M.2 SSDs, make sure you're installing the fastest one on the first slot. Take a look at the read and write speeds on the box to determine which one is the fastest. Installing the fastest M.2 SSD on the first slot means that your operating system is going to be installed on that drive, and it's going to impact how fast your PC boots. It's also going to impact how fast your applications and games load up as well, which is why I recommend putting the fastest drive in the first slot. So go ahead and locate the top M.2 SSD slot on your motherboard. And in some mid-range and high-end boards, you will have a heat shield covering it, which is completely normal. This is where the precision screwdriver kit that I recommended earlier comes in handy, because the screws for these are always very tiny, and you're gonna need small bits to remove it. Start by removing the 2 screws from the heat shield. Some motherboards don't have screws, instead use latches like the one featured in this video, so do keep that in mind. Once the heat shield is removed, go ahead and peel the plastic sleeve from the thermal pads right now, so that we don't forget to do it later. If you look at your M.2 SSD, you will see a small gap on one side. We're going to align that gap with the notch on the M.2 slot on the motherboard. And then afterwards, gently slide it in, just like on the weekend nights. Depending on the motherboard, you will either have to screw in the other end or simply use a latch system and lock it in place. If you have to screw it in, you can find the small screw inside the motherboard box. So take that out of the bag and install it before covering it back up with the armor plate. Now, if your M.2 SSD has a built-in heatsink, then you have the option of not using the included armor on your motherboard. You can just follow the same installation process as before and leave the armor piece out. Do keep in mind, this might look a little weird, but if you're okay with how it looks, then you can proceed. Alternatively, you can remove the heatsink. Usually there are tiny screws on the side that you can unscrew before sliding out the heatsink. In some other cases, you might have to use a pry bar and detach the heatsink before sliding out the drive. Luckily, the screwdriver kit I mentioned earlier has an included pry bar that can help in this situation. If you're installing a second M.2 SSD, just repeat the same process for however many drives you're installing, and then we can move on to the cooler. I will show you guys how to install 4 different types of coolers. The stock Wraith cooler from AMD or Intel, the stock Wraith Prism cooler from select Ryzen 7 processors, an aftermarket air cooler, or a liquid all-in-one cooler. But before we jump into that section, I'll show you guys how to apply thermal paste if you need it for your build. If your CPU cooler already comes with thermal paste pre-applied, you can skip on over to the next section. You can easily check this, by the way, by simply looking underneath your cooler or your pump if you're using an AIO. If you see any type of gray compound, then it means it's already applied for you, and we don't need to add any extra paste. Simply remove the cap of your thermal paste, which is always provided in the box of the CPU cooler that you have purchased. Next, bring the tip as close as possible to the surface of your CPU while holding it at an angle and begin to gently squeeze out the guts. I always prefer drawing a line on the top of the CPU and using a small spatula or a flat object to spread the paste. I like doing this because it gives me peace of mind that the entire CPU face is covered. But if you don't have a spatula, it's completely fine. You can just do a bunch of tiny dots spaced out evenly, which is just as effective. In the event that you need to clean the thermal paste off the CPU or the cooler, just use 99% isopropyl alcohol. Dab a little bit of it on one side of a folded paper towel and begin wiping the surface clean. Feel free to use as many as you need to clean all the paste off the surface completely. Okay, now it's time to figure out what cooler you're installing and skip over to that section of the video. Okay, we're installing a stock cooler. It doesn't matter if it's from AMD or Intel, the process is exactly the same. Start off by removing the cooler from the box, making sure not to touch the bottom because that is where the thermal paste is applied. Figure out the orientation that you want to install the cooler. You only have 2 options for AMD, and they are both vertical. If you position the AMD logo on the right side, make sure that it doesn't interfere with the memory sticks. If the memory sticks are too tall, then you have to rotate the cooler to the other way around so that the logo doesn't interfere with them. Now that we have figured out the orientation, go ahead and remove the 2 black plastic brackets if you're installing on the AM5 socket. And make sure to keep these in the motherboard box because they might be useful in the future. If you're using an older Intel motherboard, you don't have to remove the brackets because it doesn't have any. Grab your Intel or AMD cooler and gently lower it down while aligning the 4 screws with the 4 holes on the motherboard. And once the cooler is sitting on top of the CPU, begin to slowly tighten each screw in a crisscross pattern. Do not fully tighten each one of them just yet. Start from the top left and do a single hand turn and move on to the bottom right and do the same thing. Then move to the top right and then the bottom left, and rinse and repeat until all 4 screws are fully tightened. Feel free to grab and tug on the cooler gently to make sure it's completely tightened. Grab the cable coming out of the cooler and plug this into the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which is often located on the top right side. You can easily determine which one to plug in because it's labeled CPU-fan next to the 4 pins that you need to plug into. Okay, so we're installing the stock Wraith Prism cooler from AMD. This is extremely easy to do because the brackets are already pre-installed on all AMD motherboards, regardless if you're using the AM4 or the new AM5 socket. Start by removing the cooler from the box and the plastic covers, and make sure not to touch the bottom of the cooler because that is where the thermal paste is applied. Let's first plug in the 2 included cables. One is for the RGB control, which has 4 small holes, and the other is for the USB header, which transfers data to the board. Begin by peeling out the rubber inserts from the side of the cooler, and then proceed to plug in both of the smaller ends of the cables into the side of the cooler. These only go in one way, so you can't mess it up. You can either install the cooler with the AMD logo facing towards the top left, or flip it upside down. I personally prefer upside down because it will be a lot easier to route the 2 cables coming out of the cooler and keep it hidden. The cooler has these retention brackets on the front and the back. Locate the side that has the lever and make sure that is set to the left position. Gently lower the cooler down onto the CPU while making sure the other side without the lever goes in first and it hooks underneath the brackets on the motherboard. Then you can slide in the other hook onto the other bracket. Once both brackets are attached, lock the CPU in place by simply moving the lever to the opposite side. This will feel tight. It's completely normal. Grab the thick braided cable that looks like this and route the cable underneath the cooler and upwards towards the top of the motherboard. Locate the CPU fan header, which is usually located on the top right side, and it's often labeled CPU_fan. Slide it in the 4-pin header. Next, grab the other 2 small cables and run it behind the motherboard and out from the bottom. If you install the cooler the way I did, you should be able to run the cables towards the top and around the VRM heatsink just like this before running it down the back of the motherboard. Grab the cable that has 4 small holes like this, which is called a 12-volt 4-pin RGB cable, and plug it into the 12-volt RGB header on the board. This usually has a label that says 12V right next to it. It should also have 4 pins. Make sure the arrow on the plug is aligned with the first pin. You can simply rotate the cable until the arrow is on the far left, and then you could slide it in. Whatever you do, do not plug this into the 3-pin header. Those are for addressable RGB products only. Next, grab the USB cable that has the words USB labeled on it and plug that into the USB header on your motherboard, which is often located on the bottom, and it's always labeled USB 1 or USB 2 depending on how many USB headers your board has. In the event that you run out of USB headers for other products, you can always buy a USB adapter which will expand the amount of ports on your board. I'll drop a link to this one down below if anyone needs it. Anyways, with the words facing down, plug these in either of your USB headers. I'm sure we can all agree that running the cables behind the motherboard looks the cleanest. You can install it in the case just like this, by the way, without having to unplug anything. Okay, so we are now installing an aftermarket air cooler. Let's take everything out of its box, including the cooler, the thermal paste if it has one, the bags that have the screws and the brackets, and finally the manual. If you're installing on an AMD motherboard, you will most likely have to remove the 2 brackets that are pre-installed on the board. If you're installing on an Intel motherboard, you have to use the X-shaped bracket instead. I would strongly recommend looking at the manual to determine how to set up the bracket, because you can adjust the endpoints to fit specific socket types. By default, it usually fits LGA 1150 series sockets, but I'm using a 14900K processor which is on the LGA 1700 socket. So in my case, I have to extend the endpoints all the way out for the LGA 1700 sockets. Afterwards, you can peel off the cover on the adhesive tape if yours have one and flip your motherboard over. We are simply going to align the X bracket with the 4 holes and insert it in. You can apply gentle pressure, making sure the tape grabs onto the back of the motherboard before flipping it over. If you don't have any tape, you're gonna have to use your hand and hold onto the bracket while you flip the board over. Now we should all technically be at the same place, whether you're installing in an AMD board or Intel. All 4 screw holes should be visible. At this time, I would recommend looking in the manual to determine what the next step is. Usually it involves installing a certain type of screw, but in my case, I have to add these spacers first. Most coolers have everything nicely separated and labeled in bags, making it very easy to find the hardware needed. If you're installing an AMD cooler, you would use the bag labeled either AM4, AM5, or any of the TR. But if you're installing an Intel cooler, just make sure to use the bag that corresponds to the socket type for your CPU. Again, you can find this socket type labeled on the motherboard itself and the CPU box. After removing the spacers from the bag, simply slide one onto each of the screw hole before we install the bracket. Again, refer to the manual to find out which hole to put the screw through. Every socket is different. After inserting the screw through the bracket, gently tighten them all the way through. These need to be fully tightened so that the cooler has a nice grip on the CPU. After both brackets are installed, it's time to connect the heatsink. Depending on the location of the bracket on the heatsink, you usually can only install this in the vertical orientation. If you have a choice, I would recommend this orientation so that we can install the fans in the front for the best cooling performance. I don't recommend facing the heatsink down and installing the fans on the bottom or top, as this is the least effective configuration. Once you determine the orientation bracket we just installed, now we are ready to hook up the fans. Normally, air coolers come with these thin brackets that attach to the fan. If your cooler has only one fan, then I recommend attaching it to the front of the heatsink. If you have 2 fans, you can put the second one in the back. Make sure the face of the fan is facing outwards. The face of the fan is where the air is being sucked in from. And the best way to remember this is by remembering the phrase, faces suck. The face of the fan is the part where the company logo or sticker usually is. And the part where the frames and the cables are visible is the back. Unless your fans are reverse blades. Reverse blades are usually indicated right on the fan box. And in this case, the airflow is reversed, which means that the front of the fan is where the air gets blown out of. You can also tell by looking at the side of the fans. Most of the fans have arrows indicating the airflow direction. Speaking of cables, make sure the cable is towards the bottom so it's easier to hide and plug into the motherboard. So grab the fan and insert one tip of the bracket through the front hole. And you can do the same thing for the other corner. If you did this correctly, this is what it should look like. It's completely fine if it's loose. It's supposed to be. Side of the fan. With both brackets installed, lower the fan in front of the heatsink and pull on the bracket until the small part sits on the heatsink fins. Do the same thing on the other side. Repeat the same process for however many fans you are installing the cooler to make sure nothing is loose. Grab the cable coming out of the fan and plug this into the fan header on your motherboard, which is usually located on the top. It's always labeled CPU_fan. I like to tuck the excess cable underneath the cooler so it looks nicer, but the choice is yours. Okay, so we're installing an all-in-one cooler, but we are only going to do the first half, which is prepping the motherboard with the bracket installation before we move everything into the case. This is a lot easier for the build. Go ahead and open the box and remove everything from inside. The manual, which will be very handy, all the fans, unless it's already attached to the radiator, thermal paste, unless it's already pre-applied, and the rest of the hardware, which includes all the different type of brackets, screws, and cables. I know it might look intimidating with all the different types of hardware, but you are not going to use all of these, trust me. We're only going to use the ones that are marked for our CPU. Take a quick look at the manual and determine what hardware you need to use to install your cooler. Different socket types require a different pump bracket as well as a motherboard bracket. In our case, we are installing on an LGA 1700 socket, so we will need the LGA 1700 pump bracket, the LGA 1700 screws, and the LGA 1700 mounting bracket, which looks like this. Again, if you don't know what socket type your CPU uses, you can always look on the CPU box itself or the motherboard. If you're installing on an AMD board, you would have to remove the 2 mounting brackets that are pre-installed on your board. Otherwise, for Intel, flip over the motherboard and attach the mounting bracket on the back. You might have to extend the tips so that the screw holes align with the holes in the back of the motherboard. And if your mounting bracket doesn't have tape, you're gonna have to hold onto the bracket with one hand and use the other and flip the board back over, making sure the mounting bracket doesn't slide away. Proceed to hand tighten the screws into the mounting bracket itself. This process is very similar to AMD motherboards. Okay, so at this point, we are done with the prepping, and you have two options. Either continue on with the video so we can hook up the rest of the AIO, that way we can test the PC and make sure it works before building in the case, which I highly recommend, by the way. Or you can skip to the part where we start building inside the case. You made a wise choice, young grasshopper. Okay, so grab the corresponding pump bracket for your socket type and install it onto your pump. Start off at an angle before inserting it in the pump, and then you can rotate it to snap it in place. If you did it correctly, the bracket should look like this, even on all four sides. Now let's put the cooler aside and connect the fans. If your fans are magnetic, simply attach them together and plug in the magnetic cable adapter from the end. If they're not magnetic, you can just simply lay them on the radiator. Do not tighten them with the screws because it's not needed right now. Most AIOs have a way to connect the radiator to the fans. In this case, we have two cables to plug in. One is a CPU fan header and the other is for the RGB. But yours may vary, so please refer to your manual to learn how to connect your AIO. The fan header cable simply plugs into the female connector from the radiator. The 3-pin RGB cable plugs into the female 3-pin RGB connector, but make sure the holes align and that the arrows match before you do that. If your cooler doesn't have any thermal paste pre-applied, then go back and watch the thermal paste application segment of the video to learn how to apply thermal paste properly. And then you can come back and resume watching from here. The orientation of the pump doesn't matter now because this is temporary until we test our system. Before you do anything else, make sure to peel off the sticker underneath your pump. Then go ahead and grab the head of the pump and slowly lower it down by matching the holes from the bracket to the screws on the mounting bracket. Look for the bag that has the thumb screw caps or something similar and remove all four of them. While holding down the pump with one hand, use your other hand to screw and tighten the pump bracket. The two longer cables coming out of the pump plug into your motherboard. Let's grab the USB cable first, which looks like this. It's got a rectangular shape with 9 pinholes. We are going to plug this into the USB header on the motherboard, which is usually on the bottom, and it's always labeled USB 1 or 2 depending on how many your board has. Align the holes on the cable with the pins on the board and insert it all the way in. The second cable is the SATA power cable. For this, we are going to take out our power supply and look for the cable that looks like this. The SATA cable has an L-shaped connection, so make sure to align that with the female cable and plug it in. Okay, so at this point, I strongly recommend finishing up the build outside of the case. That way we can test it and make sure it turns on without any problems, because it will be so much easier to fix it if we do run into an issue. However, if you don't want to do it that way and you are confident that all the parts work, you can skip this section. Okay, so we're going to finish building the PC outside the case first. So the next step is going to be the graphics card. Take that out of the box and remove it from the anti-static bag. And also remove all the plastic pieces from the rear ports and the plastic cover from the PCI connector. Move the motherboard to the edge of the box so that the PCI bracket from the GPU can hang over. Then locate the top PCI slot on your motherboard and slowly lower the GPU into it while making sure the gap on the GPU aligns with the notch on the PCI slot. There will be a latch towards the right side that will snap in place once the GPU is fully seated. If it's not fully closed, that means the GPU is not completely seated. So apply some more pressure on the graphics card until you hear it click. You can also inspect the PCI slot from an angle to make sure that the GPU is completely seated before moving on. Now let's hook up the power supply. Take that out of the box and remove all the cables from the bag. Unless your power supply is non-modular, then all the cables are already attached to the unit. We're going to start off with the 24-pin cable, which is the widest cable in the kit. If your power supply is fully modular, take the other end of the 24-pin cable and plug it into the back of the power supply. These usually have two separate connections that are combined into one cable. These only go in one specific location in the back of the power supply, and the easiest way to tell is by either looking at the labels above the connectors that usually say motherboard or M/B, or by simply counting each connector. Make sure the clip is facing the correct orientation of the ports before inserting it in, and always double check to make sure that the clip is locked in with no gap between the connection. If this is not fully seated, you might have issues powering on your PC. Next, we're going to plug the head of the 24-pin cable into the 24-pin socket on the motherboard, which is often located on the right side. Make sure the connector is fully seated and the latch is locked in. There should be no gap between the 24-pin head and the socket on the motherboard. You might need to apply some extra force to snap it in place, as this can be slightly stiff. Next, locate the 8-pin EPS cable, which looks something like this. These usually come in two separate 8-pin cables, or both 8-pin cables are attached together like this one in the video. You can easily tell what these look like if you look closely. You can see that the connectors are actually split into two separate 4 pins. This gives you the ability to plug into your EPS connectors on your motherboard in increments of 4. The EPS connectors are located usually on the top left of your motherboard, and there are only 4 variations: a single 4-pin, 8-pin, dual 8-pin, or one 8-pin and one 4-pin. Hence why the connectors are split into half. So for example, this motherboard has a single 8-pin and a single 4-pin. So I will need the exact amount of male EPS connectors. I'm going to use a full 8-pin and split the second one so that I can plug in the 4-pin socket. Once again, if your cables are separated from the power supply, find the end of the EPS cables and plug it into the back of the power supply. It's usually labeled power supply on the end that you need to connect to the power supply, and you can plug these into either the CPU or the PCI section of the power supply. These only go in one way, so you can't mess it up. If you're plugging in 2 EPS cables, go ahead and plug the second one in as well. Locate the EPS connectors on your motherboard and plug the head of the cables into them, while making sure they are fully seated and the clip is locked in place. If these cables are not fully seated, you might have issues powering on your PC. Last but not least, we have to supply power to the graphics card. And here is where things are a bit tricky. If you're using an AMD graphics card or an NVIDIA graphics card that has PCI connectors that look like this is how you plug the cables in. But if you're using an NVIDIA card with a 12-pin or 16-pin connector, I still want you guys to watch this part because it's going to be relevant when we do plug in those cables very soon. Okay, so each graphics card has a specific set of PCI connectors, either 1, 2, or 3 sets, with a combination of 6-pin or 8-pin connectors. The more powerful your graphics card is, the more connectors you will have. So simply count the amount of connectors your GPU is going to use. In this case, the GPU has dual 8-pin female PCI connectors. So we will need dual 8-pin male PCI connectors from the power supply. Some cables have 2 PCI connectors attached to a single cable, and others have 1 attached to a single cable. Although the cable with 2 connectors attached are always going to be an eyesore no matter what you do, which is why I recommend going with cable extensions, which looks so much nicer. I'll drop a link to these down below if anyone is interested in picking them up, but don't worry too much video. Okay, so once you determined how many PCI connectors you need from the power supply, grab them and locate the end of the cables that's usually labeled power supply. And we're going to plug those into either the CPU or the PCI section of the power supply. If your cable isn't labeled, just like mine in the video, then that's fine. Just look for the end of the cable that has a full 8-pin connection without any seams. Again, these only go in one way, so it's impossible to mess it up. Then we are going to grab the head of the male PCI connectors and plug these into the graphics card's female PCI slots. As always, ensure that the clip is resting over the notch and that there is no gap between the connections. Otherwise, you might not get any display from your graphics card. Okay, now if you have an NVIDIA 30 series or a higher GPU with a 12-pin or a 16-pin connector that looks something like this, then you're going to use the included adapter cable. Unless your power supply comes with a 12VH power cable included, which looks like this. It usually has the words 600W written on the connectors, and it has a total of 16 pins. If your power supply has this, skip over to the next section. Otherwise, continue watching. Plug the male portion of the connector into the graphics card, making sure the clip sits over the notch and that there is no gap between the connection. The rest of the steps are exactly the same as before when plugging into the PCI connectors. Just figure out how many connectors your GPU needs by simply counting each female connector and plug in the corresponding male connector from the power supply. For example, mine has 3 female connections, so I have to plug in 3 male connectors from the power supply. This is arguably one of the most atrocious things that NVIDIA has invented, and it really does ruin the look of your system. I strongly recommend buying a PCI Gen 5 cable extension from Amazon, which eliminates the need to use the ugly adapter from NVIDIA. It has a protective shroud on the tip, which protects your cable from getting damaged, and it comes with really nice looking cable combs. You simply plug in one end into the graphics card, and you plug the PCI connectors into the other ends. Look how much nicer this looks compared to before. They come in both white and black colors, by the way, and I'll drop a link to them down below. Okay, so we are plugging in the included 12 VH power cable from the power supply. If your power supply doesn't come with one of these, skip over to the next section. These cables go in both ways, just like my friend Harry. Grab either end and plug it into the graphics card's 16-pin slot, making sure it's fully seated, and plug the other end into the back of the power supply, usually labeled 12 VH power. And finally, if your cooler requires a SATA cable, then we need to plug this into the power supply as well. So go ahead and find the cable that looks like this and plug the female cable into the male cable. These only go in one way, so don't worry about it doing it wrong. The other end of the cable has a 6-pin connection that looks like this, and this goes into any 6-pin socket in the back of the power supply. Usually this is labeled peripheral, SATA, or Molex. It's the only socket in the back of the power supply that has 6 pins. Okay, so you're done for now. We will plug in the rest of the power supply cables later in this video, so continue watching. This is what your setup should look like if you have a stock cooler installed. And this is what it should look like if you have an AIO installed. I know it looks extremely messy, but this is temporary until we finish testing the PC and making sure it boots. Now locate and find the thick power supply cable, which should be inside the bag of the power supply box, which looks something like this. And we're going to plug the female port into the back of the power supply. And the other end goes into your wall outlet. Make sure to switch the power supply to the on position by flipping the switch in the back to the straight line symbol. And finally, you do need a monitor and a keyboard for this next step. Go ahead and plug your keyboard into the back of the motherboard. You can use any of the USB ports that are available. Now grab your monitor's HDMI or DisplayPort cable and plug that into the back of your graphics card. Make sure you do not plug this into the back of the motherboard, otherwise you will get no signal. Okay, now we're ready to power on the PC. You're going to need a thin metal object. A screwdriver tip works just as great. Locate the JFP1 connector on the motherboard, which is usually on the bottom right side. There are going to be a total of 9 pins, 4 on the top row and 5 on the bottom row. Using the tip of the screwdriver, we are going to tap both the 3rd and the 4th pin at the same time. To do this easily, just simply put the tip between both of those pins. If you did it correctly, the PC will automatically boot. Now what we're waiting for here is any type of message on your monitor. As soon as it gets signal from your GPU, it will display a message like this. Although yours might be different depending on the manufacturer of your motherboard. This process can take a while. I'm talking up to 10 minutes, especially if this is your first boot. It's completely normal if your PC restarts a few times. Just let it do its thing. Mine actually restarted about 7 times, and this entire process took about 9 minutes to finally get into the BIOS. You can also check out the motherboard's boot status by looking at the section with the LEDs to determine if there's an actual error with any of your components. If you see any type of message, then your PC works. Immediately tap both of the pins again to shut it off, or you can simply switch off the power supply switch from the back. If you don't see a message, skip over to the troubleshooting section of the video, which is shown on the screen. And once you fix the issue, you can come back and resume from this point of the video. Now that you have peace of mind that your PC is working just fine, go ahead and disconnect all the power supply cables from the motherboard, and let's move on to prepping the board for the CPU cooler, unless you have already installed. If so, skip over to the next section. All right, now we are getting into the fun stuff, actually building inside of the case. First thing we have to do is prep the case before we slide in the motherboard. Go ahead and remove all the side panels from the case. The front panel, the top if yours has one, and the rear. I would keep all the plastic covers on the panels for now until we finish building the PC to avoid accidentally scratching them. Remove the bag or the box that has all of your hardware in it, along with the manual for additional help. In most cases, this is usually tucked away inside one of the hard drive cages. Let's start off by installing the I/O shield in the back of the case. Open your motherboard box and take out the I/O shield and remove it from its plastic bag. Most of the nicer looking boards already have this pre-installed in the back of the board. So if yours already has one, then we can skip this step. Locate the rectangular cutout in the back of the case and hold up the I/O shield upright so that the text is facing right side up. Using your right hand, slowly bring the shield towards the cutout from inside the case with the text facing outwards. Then go ahead and apply pressure on each corner one by one until it all snaps in place. This is probably the hardest part of the entire build, so take your time and make sure the entire thing is fully inserted before moving forward. Next, we need to make sure the case has all the proper standoffs installed. Most high-end cases have these pre-installed and ready to go. However, if yours don't, we need to find a bag that has these tiny little hex-shaped screws and put them aside. This is a good time to place your PC on its side so it's easier for us to install the motherboard. First, count the number of standoffs installed in the case already. It should match the exact amount of holes your motherboard has. Now, if both numbers are the same and they are installed in the correct locations, then you can lower the motherboard gently inside while making sure all the holes from your motherboard line up with the standoffs in the case. As you can see, mine is missing 3 standoffs on the side. If yours are missing some too, take the motherboard back out and install any additional standoffs in the location that is needed. Smaller micro ATX motherboards require less standoffs because the board is tiny, whereas full ATX or eATX boards will need 9 to 10 standoffs. If you look closely, most cases will have labels etched near the standoff holes. A, M, I, E. ATX, micro ATX, ITX, and extended ATX. Find the size of your motherboard, which is always written behind the motherboard box, and install the standoffs to where it corresponds to your motherboard size. So in this case, if you're installing an ATX motherboard like I am, there should be a standoff next to every hole with the letters A. After all the standoffs are installed, grab the motherboard by its sides as you slowly lower it down, making sure to align the rear I/O of your motherboard with the cutouts in the I/O shield. If you have a cooler installed, you can use your other hand to grab onto the cooler, making it easier to lower the board down in the case. You can tell if the motherboard is correctly placed by looking at the holes and making sure you can see the standoffs through each one of them. Go ahead and grab the box or bag that has all the hardware and look for these small motherboard screws. We're going to use these to secure the motherboard to the case. You can start from anywhere and begin to screw these in one by one until you are done with all of them. This is also the best time to hook up the front panel connectors because it gets harder when there's a lot of components inside the case. So I'd rather get this out of the way right now. Every case comes with a set of cables attached. These are usually grouped up together with a cable tie, and it's located in the back of the case. Go ahead and untie all the cables and find the USB 3 cable, which looks like this. Sometimes this has a blue tip. We're going to plug this into the USB 3 header on the motherboard, which is usually on the middle right side. And sometimes it might even be on the bottom. Depending on the motherboard, it will either have the face up or it will be laying on its side. Either way, we're going to line up the notch on the cable with the gap on the USB 3 header and carefully slide it in. These pins can get bent fairly easily if you go in at an angle, so be careful when you do this. I always recommend lining up the pins first and going straight in. Now these are a little tight, so you might have to use a little force. Some cases have a total of 4 USB 3 ports. If that's the case, then you might have 2 USB 3 cables instead of 1. If yours does, simply plug that in the second USB header on your motherboard if you have one. Otherwise, just leave it in the back of your case. The next cable is the USB-C cable that looks like this. If your case doesn't have a USB Type-C port, then you most likely won't have a cable like this. This one plugs into the onboard USB-C port on the motherboard, typically located near the USB 3 header. This cable only goes in one way, so if you're having trouble putting it in, like my ex used to tell me, flip it over to the other side and try it again. If your case has a USB cable that looks like this, usually with the words USB on it, then we need to plug this into one of the USB headers on the motherboard, which is always on the bottom middle. If your case doesn't have one of these cables, you can skip on over to the next section. It doesn't matter which one you plug this into, just make sure the text is facing down and insert it in the connector. A quick note, if you run out of USB headers on your board for your other devices, you can buy a USB header splitter that will expand the number of ports. I'll leave a link below to one if you need it. The next cable we're going to plug in is the HD audio. This is to provide power to the front audio jacks of your PC. The audio header is usually on the bottom far left side, and it's often labeled JAUD1. Similar to the USB cable, this one also has 9 pins and only plugs in one way. So align the pins with the holes on the cable and plug it in all the way. This cable is optional, but if your case comes with a 5-volt 3-pin RGB header cable, then it means that you probably have some sort of RGB lighting attached to the case, whether it's from an RGB strip or a set of pre-installed RGB fans. The cable looks like this with 3 holes. This plugs into any of the 3-pin RGB headers on your motherboard. This can be found either somewhere near the top or on the bottom. If your motherboard doesn't have a 3-pin RGB header, then you can't plug this cable in, which means you won't be able to control the RGB lights of your case or your fans. So align the 3 holes from the cable with the 3 pins on the board and slide it in all the way. And finally, let's hook up these tiny little turds, the JFP1 connectors. Most of the time, they are split up into multiple little pieces like this, and in other high-end cases, they are combined into a single connector like this, and it's often labeled F-panel. But the hookup process is the same regardless of what type you have. First, we're going to locate the JFP1 header on the motherboard, which is usually on the bottom right. It's also often labeled JFP1 on most boards. If you have a high-end board, they might be combined with other headers like this, but don't be confused. We are still only focusing on the first 9 pins on the left side. The JFP1 header consists of 9 total pins, and they are each labeled right on the motherboard itself and in the manual. The top row has 4 pins and the bottom has 5. If your front panel connector is all attached to a single connector, then just simply align the 9 pins together and slide it in and you're done. But if your case has them individually separated, like here in the video, then we will have to do this one by one. One thing to note is that you might not have all of these cables. Some cases only have 2, while others have more, so don't freak out. Okay, let's start off by grabbing the 2 tiniest cables, the Power LED Plus and the Power LED Minus. If you look at the labels on the board itself or your motherboard's manual, you can see that the Power LED Plus is the very first pin on the top, and the minus is the second pin right next to it. So let's start off by grabbing the plus cable and plug this into the first pin. Then grab the minus cable and plug that into the second pin. Next, let's do the power switch. The power switch goes into the third and fourth pins from the top, right next to the ones we just plugged in. So this is how the plugged in cable should look like on the top row so far. Now let's grab the cable that says HDD LED and plug this into the first and second pin on the bottom row. It doesn't matter how you plug this one in. But this last one, labeled reset switch, doesn't matter how you plug this one in. This one goes in the third and fourth pin on the bottom row, right next to the HDD LED we just plugged in. Make sure the words are facing down before plugging this in. This is how the bottom row should look like if done correctly. Okay, so now that we got the annoying cables out of the way, let's finish up plugging in the all-in-one cooler. If you already installed your air cooler from before, you can skip this step. So in most cases, you can install the AIO in one of 4 locations, assuming your case supports it. You can put it on the bottom, the top, or mount it vertically, either in the back side if you have a fish tank style case, or in the front. I would avoid putting the radiator on the bottom for several reasons. Number 1, it's just not aesthetically pleasing and the tubes might get in the way of the graphics card. But more importantly, number 2, your pump will be loud and it will shorten the lifespan of your AIO. You always want the pump to be at the lowest point of the loop, and I'll talk more about that later in the video. If you want to focus on CPU cooling primarily, then you should mount it vertically and set the fans as intake, so that fresh air is being pulled from outside the case, goes through the radiator, and cools the CPU. However, if you want to focus on cooling the GPU more, I would mount the radiator on the top bracket. It's also arguably one of the best looking orientations for an AIO. So once you figure out how you want to mount the AIO, go ahead and find a bag of short and long screws that came with your cooler box and put them aside because we're gonna need these very soon. Before we decide where to install the radiator, we need to figure out the fan configuration first. So the first thing we need to do is attach the fans together if your fans are able to. Please refer to the manual as every fan is different. For example, these Corsair RX 120 fans are attached to each other by 2 connectors. On the other hand, the Aurus fans I'm using simply attach together magnetically like so. Then there is usually a single cable that is attached at the end of the entire fan set, and this connects either to a separate controller or they plug directly into the radiator itself, like the Aurus cooler I'm using in this build. Again, feel free to read the manual if you need more help. If you're not connecting any fans together, then just continue watching the video. We now need to figure out the orientation of the fans and decide if you want to do a push or pull configuration. Remember we talked about faces suck. The face part of the fan is where the air is being sucked in from. So if it's facing the right, it's sucking air in from the right and blowing it out from the back. Additionally, the airflow is labeled on the side of most fans. The arrow indicates the direction of the airflow. If it's facing the right, then the air is traveling from left to right. If we put the fan in front of the radiator, this is considered a push configuration. Air is being pushed through the radiator. If the fan is in the back of the radiator, it's considered a pull configuration because the air is being pulled through the radiator. There's really no major difference on where you put the fans, either in the front or the back of the radiator. It all comes down to maintenance and aesthetics. If you want the fans to be visible, put it in the front so that you can see it through the case, especially if you're installing the radiator on the top. You want to be able to see the beautiful fans from the bottom and not just the ugly radiator fins. Additionally, you can take this a step further and do a push and pull configuration, meaning you can sandwich the radiator with fans on both sides. If you do this, make sure the fans are facing the same direction and that your case is big enough to support such configurations. Okay, so now we are ready to decide where you want to install the AIO. So go ahead and decide and skip over to the portion of that video. Okay, so you're installing the radiator on the top of the case. Good choice. Start off by removing the top panel of your case to get easy access to the bracket. Some cases have removable brackets, which makes it a lot easier to install the radiator. If yours does, go ahead and remove that out of the case and proceed with the installation. If you're installing the fans underneath the radiator or a push configuration, we are going to use the long screws. So place the radiator flat on the table and align each of the fan holes with the holes on the radiator. This is a good time to position the cables towards the back so that we can easily route them through the back of the case once we install the AIO. Go ahead and screw all the fans onto the radiator. Flip it so that the tubes are hanging down and place it underneath the top bracket. And use your other hand to screw in from the top using the smaller screws that came with the cooler. Only install 2 screws for the time being, one on each opposite corner, but do not fully tighten them. You should be able to slide the radiator back and forth. You can either have the tube coming down from the right side or the left side. It's entirely up to you, but most people like the tubes coming down from the right side as it does look the cleanest. We can now skip over to the next section. Okay, so you decided to install the AIO vertically. Start off by removing the panel of your case to get easy access to the bracket. If you're installing it in the front, remove the front panel. And if you're installing it in the back, remove the rear panel. Some cases have removable brackets, which makes it a lot easier to install the radiator. If yours does, go ahead and remove that out of the case and proceed with the installation. This is a good time to position the cables towards the back so that we can easily route them through the back of the case after the installation. Also, make sure the tubes are at the top here. However, if you really like the look of the tubes on the bottom and you have space for it, by all means, do what your heart desires. But whatever you do, do not put the pump above the top of the radiator. Otherwise, you will damage it and reduce its lifespan. The pump section needs to always be underneath the top section of the radiator. For example, this is not okay. The pump in this situation is above the radiator. This is also not recommended. Both the pump and the top of the radiator are at the same level, and this can also damage the pump and reduce the lifespan. This is the only correct way of doing it. It doesn't matter how low the pump is compared to the top of the radiator, as long as it's visibly underneath it. If you're installing the fans closer to the bracket, then you might need some help because it's a little tricky to do it, as you have to hold onto the radiator and the fans while you somehow manage to screw it in through the bracket. This is why it's a lot easier building in cases with removable brackets. But do what you can and hold up the fans against the radiator long enough until you can feed the longer screws through it. I recommend installing one in the opposite corners of the radiator first, because that should be good enough to hold everything up together until you finish the rest up. Otherwise, if the radiator is closest to the bracket, it's a lot easier to do. Just simply use the long screws and secure the fans to the radiator first. Then you can simply just use one hand and hold up the entire thing against the bracket while you screw it in from the back using the smaller screws. A quick reminder here, if you're installing the radiator in the back like I have in the video, don't forget to flip the fans the other way around if you're going for intake and you're focusing on CPU cooling. Okay, now we're ready to secure the pump and connect the cables. Whatever you do, do not run the pump cables across the VRMs. It simply looks terrible. If you can, route them between the VRMs and the memory DIMM slots. There's usually just enough space where you can slide them through. This looks much cleaner. You can decide what orientation you want to install the pump. I personally always have the cables towards the top, so it's easier to hide them, but it's entirely up to you. In some cases, you don't have a choice on the orientation because the screen is already fixed. If the pump doesn't reach the CPU, feel free to slide the radiator towards the left to create more slack, assuming you didn't tighten the screws. If your cooler doesn't have any thermal paste pre-applied and there isn't any on the CPU already, you can go back and watch the thermal application section of the video and then come back here to continue. Peel the plastic cover underneath the pump, if there is one, and gently bring the pump closer to the CPU while aligning the 4 holes from the bracket to the 4 screws on the motherboard. As you are holding the pump with one hand, begin screwing in the thumb screws with your other hand. I would focus on installing only 2 for now so that it can hold the pump in place while you focus on screwing in the other 2. Once all 4 thumb screws are in, you can begin by tightening them in a crisscross pattern until they are all fully tightened. Then you can go back to the top of the case and finish securing the radiator to the bracket. Now that we have the cooler installed, it's time to plug in the cables. I'll go over all the common cables that your cooler usually comes with, but if I miss anything, I strongly recommend looking at the liquid cooler manual for additional help. The first common cable is a fan header cable. This typically comes out of the pump and it looks like this. This plugs into the pump header on your motherboard, which is usually near the top, right next to the CPU fan header. If it's not there, check the right side of the board. This is often labeled AIO pump. You always want to plug the pump of your AIO into the pump header so that it's always running at max speed. If your motherboard doesn't have one of these, you can simply plug it into the CPU fan header instead. However, if you do that, we have to go into the BIOS and max out the CPU fan speed. Write down the timestamp listed on the screen right now so you don't forget it. After we finish building the PC, this is the first thing we need to do. You will also most likely have a USB header cable that looks like this with 9 holes, and it's usually labeled USB right on the cable. This plugs into the USB header on the bottom of your motherboard, often labeled JUSB 1 or USB 2, depending on how many you have. This only goes in one way, but you can usually have the text facing down before inserting it in. Another cable you might have coming out of your pump or controller is a SATA power cable. This is a flat cable with an L-shaped connector. This plugs into the female SATA power cable from the power supply. If your power supply is fully modular, meaning all the cables are disconnected, you can find this cable right now and plug it in so that you don't forget later in the build process. If your cooler has RGB lights, then you probably have an RGB cable connected to your pump or your controller. It looks something like this with 3 open holes. This plugs into any 5-volt 3-pin RGB header located on your motherboard. This can either be somewhere near the top edge or the bottom edge of your board. Almost every motherboard has at least one of these. Make sure to align the holes on the cable to the pins on the board and slide it in. In the event that you run out of RGB headers on the motherboard, you would need to buy a splitter to extend the amount of headers. Once again, I'll drop a link to one I recommend buying for your build. And lastly, although very outdated, some coolers might still use a Molex connection for power. It looks something like this, and this too comes out of your power supply. So if your power supply cables are separated, you can find this cable right now and plug it in. Don't worry about plugging in the other end just now. We'll do that later in the video. In some newer components, like the Corsair iCUE Link lineup, PCI cables are needed to supply power. So make sure to plug the necessary cables in from the power supply. Okay, at this point, the motherboard is inside the case and you have your cooler installed with all the cables plugged in. If there are still cables not plugged in, go back and watch that part of the video again. If you're installing any additional fans in your case, continue watching the video. Otherwise, if you're sticking with the pre-installed case fans, skip to the next section of the video. This would be the best time to install the power supply. So go ahead and take that out of the box, along with all the cables inside the pouch, as well as the thicker power cable. If your power supply has all the cables already plugged in the unit, then you can skip over to the next section of the video. If your power supply is fully modular or semi-modular, then continue watching. First, let's grab the 24-pin ATX cable that looks like this. It's hard to miss because this is the biggest cable. The end where it splits into two connectors is the end that you need to plug in the back of the power supply. It's usually labeled M/B motherboard or simply 24-pin. Next, grab the EPS cables. These will always have 8-pin connectors, and in most power supplies, it's labeled CPU on the end of the cable that plugs in the motherboard. If you look closely, you can see that these split into dual 4-pin connectors. That's how you can tell that these are EPS cables. So grab the opposite end and plug this into any of the ports behind the power supply labeled CPU, EPS, or PCIe. The amount of connectors you need will depend on how many EPS connectors your motherboard has. This is usually on the top left of the motherboard. So go ahead and count how many holes you see and plug in however many cables you need into the power supply. In my case, I have dual 8-pin connectors totaling 16. So I will be using 2 EPS cables, giving me a total of 16 connectors as well. Your board might have less. Now let's plug in the SATA cable. Only plug this in if you have any devices that require SATA power. This can be anything from liquid coolers to fan hubs, RGB controllers, RGB devices, and more. If you look around and don't see any of your components using this type of cable, then we don't have to install it. But if you do, grab the 6-pin connector and plug this into any of the ports beyond the power supply that says peripheral, SATA, or Molex. It's the only 6-pin socket in the back of the power supply. Same thing with the Molex. There's a high chance you won't use this because it's outdated, but if you have anything that requires Molex power, then plug the 6-pin connector into any of the 6-pin sockets labeled peripheral, SATA, or Molex. And finally, the cables for your graphics card. This will vary depending on what GPU you are using. If you're using an NVIDIA graphics card that has a 12-pin or 16-pin socket like this, and your power supply comes with a PCI Gen 5 cable that looks like this, usually with the word 600W written on both connectors, then simply plug one end into the back of the power supply labeled 12VH power. By the way, this cable goes in both ways, just like my friend Harry. If your power supply doesn't have a PCI Gen 5 cable, then we need to plug in the PCI cables instead. This usually has the words PCI labeled on the side of the connectors. If it doesn't, look closely and count the number of connectors. These have a total of 8, but you can split one into 6. If you can split it, then it's a PCI connector. Locate your graphics card and count the number of female PCI connectors your graphics card has, because that's the amount that we're gonna need. This GPU has dual 8-pin connectors, so I'll need to use a total of 16. If you are forced to use the NVIDIA adapter cable, then simply count the amount of PCI connectors you need. Each of these cables have an 8-pin connector. So if your adapter has 2 cables, then you need 16, because 8 times 2 is 16. If it has 3, then you need 24, and so on and so forth. So once we determined how many PCI cables we need, we can grab the opposite end and plug this into any of the slots in the back of the power supply labeled PCIe or CPU. Don't worry about plugging this into the graphics card just yet. We will do that once we install the graphics card later in the video. Next, go ahead and locate the area where the power supply goes. This is usually near the bottom edge of the case. You can always tell by where the giant cutout is located. If your case has vents on the bottom, then you have to face the fan on the power supply towards the bottom of the case so that it can pull in fresh air into the power supply. If your power supply gets mounted sideways, make sure the fan is facing outwards. If your case has a removable bracket, then take that out first. Install it in the back of the power supply using the screws that came with the power supply unit. After that, you can slide the power supply from the back while feeding the cables through the case. Then you can tighten the thumb screws in the back, securing the power supply. If you don't have enough room to do this because a hard drive cage is in the way, then I would suggest relocating the hard drive cage. Most cases give you the option of moving it over to make room for cables. Speaking of hard drive cages, let's take this time to plug in any additional storage devices that you have. First, open your motherboard box and locate these SATA cables. You will need one cable for each drive that you're installing. I will be hooking up one hard drive and one SSD, so in my case, I will need 2 of these cables. Look through your case manual and locate the areas where you can install a hard drive or SSD. Most cases have trays like this where you can simply slide in the drive without any tools or hardware. But in other cases, you will have to screw it in a tray or a bracket, so do keep that in mind. In my case, the storage drives are near the top. I have to remove the thumb screw first before I'm able to slide out the trays. Your tray might be in a different location entirely, but it's really hard to miss. In most cases, with a power supply shroud, it's located right underneath it. So go ahead and select which drive you're installing and skip over to that part of the video. Unless you're not installing any extra drives, then you can skip to the fan installation section of the video, which is listed on the screen. So once you determine where you want to install your hard drive, go ahead and pull out the tray. If it's toolless, you just simply need to align the pegs on the sides with the holes on the hard drive. Bring in the hard drive at an angle while making sure all the pegs slide fully inside. If you're good at getting pegged, this should be a breeze. Also, make sure the ports are facing towards the back of the tray. This will make it easy to plug in the cables once it's inside the case. If you need to secure the drive to a tray, then simply line up the holes in the tray with the holes on the hard drive before screwing them in. You can find these small screws in the hardware container that your case came with. Repeat this process for however many drives you're installing. After you're done, you can slide these back into the case. If you're installing an SSD, keep watching, otherwise skip over to the next section of the video. Okay, so you want to install an SSD. Once you determine where you want to install your SSD, go ahead and pull out the tray and locate these tiny screws from the case hardware bag. Lay the SSD on the tray while aligning the holes from the tray with the holes underneath the SSD, and make sure the ports are facing the back before you screw them in. After you're done installing all of your SSDs, slide the tray back in the case if applicable. Now let's finish plugging in all of your storage devices. If you didn't install an SSD or hard drive, skip over to the next section of the video. We're going to plug in the SATA data cable first. So grab this cable that came with your motherboard and plug one end into the smaller port in the back of either your hard drive or your SSD. The connections are the same on both of these drives. These also have an L-type connection, so make sure both ends line up together before inserting them in. An easier way to remember this is that the clip should always face towards the top of the drive. The other end of the SATA data cable has to be plugged into one of these SATA ports from the motherboard. This is usually located on the bottom right side. Next cable we need to plug in is the SATA power cable that looks like this. Plug this one right next to the other cable we just plugged in. And again, these only go in one way. So if it doesn't go in the first time, flip it over and try again. Make sure both cables are fully seated. If the other end isn't connected to the power supply, do so now. The end of the SATA power cable plugs into any of the 6 ports in the back of the power supply. Repeat this step for however many drives or SSDs you're installing. If you're not installing any additional fans in your case, you can skip to the next section. If you are installing fans, continue watching the video. So there are 3 types of air pressure in your case. Positive pressure is when you have more air going into the case than you have going out. Negative pressure is when you have more air leaving the case than going in. And neutral pressure is having the same amount of air going in and out. Ideally, you want to always strive for neutral pressure. If your case is designed in a way where neutral pressure is impossible, then you should try and go for positive pressure instead. Negative pressure is not what we want. Before we install the fans, we need to know how airflow works on a fan. Remember the phrase, faces suck? The face of the fan, often with a logo or the sticker, is where the air goes in first. So if the face is on the right, the air is being pushed in from the right and out from the left. Most fans also have a small triangle on the side indicating the direction of the airflow. And then there are fans out there with reversed blades, which have the airflow reversed. If you have a reversed fan, it means the air is being blown in from the back and out the front. This is especially important if you want the fan set as intake and still look good at the same time. For example, putting reverse fans on the bottom of your case means that they will pull in fresh air from underneath the case and still look good doing it. Also, before you install any fans, you always want to make sure the fan cable is facing towards the back of the case so that you can easily route it through the grommets. If your case only has one fan, I would recommend putting it in the front of the case, directly in front of the GPU. So somewhere in the middle to provide the best possible airflow for your graphics card. For 2 fans, I would put one as intake in the front and one either in the rear or the top of the case. For 3 fans, I would do 2 intake and 1 exhaust either in the top or rear. For 4 fans, it's really simple. 2 for intake and 2 for exhaust. For 5 fans, I would put 3 for intake and 2 for exhaust. But if you don't have any space to add 3 fans in the front, consider putting 1 on the bottom of the case if you have space for it. Otherwise, it's not the end of the world if you have 1 extra fan for exhaust. So in this case, you will have slightly more negative pressure, but it's not going to make a huge difference. 6 fans is the easiest because you can do 3 intake and 3 exhaust. Typically, if you have a 360mm AIO, you would put that either in the front or the top, and then you would just offset that with 3 fans. So if you have the fans on the radiator set as exhaust, then you would just do 3 fans in the front for intake. If you don't have a radiator, just put 3 fans on the top and then 3 fans in the front. I would avoid going with 7 fans because once again, you are put in an awkward spot. If you have 3 in the front for intake, 3 on the top for exhaust, then the last fan in the rear would give you negative pressure. If you must have 7 fans, then go for it. It's not a big deal. But if you have a really big tower that can fit quadruple 120mm fans in the front, I would just add 3 more fans up top for exhaust and you're done. Most mid-range cases can't fit 8 fans or more. So if you're in this territory, you are most likely building inside of a big tower. You can do 3 intake in the front, 3 exhaust on the top, and split the last 2 fans. You can do 1 intake on the bottom and 1 exhaust on the rear. I personally hate going with uneven fan configurations like this because aesthetically it just doesn't look good. I always strive to fill up every single fan slot in the case and balance out the pressure. If you have the space for it, I would do 4 intake and 4 exhaust. 9 fans is also very awkward because it's not an even number, but this is actually one of the most used in fish tank cases, like the 011 from Lian Li or the Corsair 6500X that I'm building in. I've seen a lot of people do exhaust on both the side and the bottom, giving you negative air. You definitely want to avoid that, especially in this case. Most popular configuration is 3 intake on the front, or in this case the side, 3 more intake on the bottom, and 3 exhaust on the top. This will give you noticeably more positive pressure, which is what you want compared to negative pressure. 10 fans is very easy. The same configuration as before, but with 1 more exhaust fan in the rear, balancing out the air pressure. At this point, you get the idea. Just follow the same methodology for installing 11 fans or more. Remember, you can always do a push and pull configuration if you want, granted your case can support it, of course. In my case, I'm going with 3 intake on the bottom, 3 intake on the side, and 3 exhaust on the top. So I'm aiming for a slightly more positive pressure, which is completely normal in a fish tank case. So after you installed all your fans, it's time to plug them in your motherboard. If these are individual fans without any special type of connection like the Aorus fans in this video, then you should see either 1 or 2 cables attached to each fan. One is a fan header cable that looks like this, either with 3 or 4 holes, and the second one will be a 3-pin RGB header cable if your fan has RGB lights. Go ahead and start plugging the fan cables of your fans into any of the fan headers on the motherboard except the CPU fan. This is dedicated to the fan that's cooling your CPU, like a stock cooler, aftermarket cooler, or an all-in-one cooler. If your CPU cooler has multiple fans attached to it, you most likely can daisy chain them together using the fan splitter that it comes with, and you can plug the fan splitter directly into the CPU fan header. I would avoid plugging your case fans into the AIO pump header because you're not able to control the speeds, as it will always run at max speed. You would have to go into the BIOS and set a custom fan curve to achieve the same behavior. So I would just avoid this altogether. If you're plugging in multiple fans and you run out of fan headers on your motherboard, which is extremely common, I strongly recommend buying a fan hub to make your job a lot easier. This way you can just plug all of your fans into one device and then plug that one fan cable from that device into any of the fan headers on the motherboard. I'll leave a link to a good quality but affordable fan header below if anyone wants to check it out. If your fans have an RGB cable that looks like this, usually with 3 holes, then we have to plug this into the 5V 3-pin ARGB header on the motherboard. Most boards usually have at least one of these headers, usually on the top right or somewhere on the bottom. If your motherboard doesn't have a 3-pin ARGB header, you can't plug these in, and your only 2 options is either to buy a board that does come with a 3-pin ARGB header or buy an ARGB fan hub like this Cooler Master one. Okay, so grab your 3-pin cable and plug it into any ARGB fan header on your motherboard. Make sure you're plugging this into the 3-pin header and not the 4-pin. Align the holes and the pins together and simply insert it in. If you do run out of ARGB headers and you can't daisy chain them together, then you will need to buy an ARGB fan hub to extend the amount of ports. However, if your fans can be daisy chained together, then you don't need any additional hubs. Like the fans I'm showing here, you can see both female and male connections for both the ARGB header cable and the fan header cable. This means you can daisy chain all the fans together without a controller. To make this super simple for you guys, just start with 2 fans first. Grab the female RGB cable from the first fan and plug this into the male RGB cable from the second fan. Do the same thing for the male fan cable. Plug this into the female cable on the second fan. Now you have daisy chained 2 fans together. If you need to connect a 3rd fan, just repeat the same process. After you are done, you should be left with 1 male fan header cable and 1 female ARGB header cable, assuming your fan has RGB, of course. You would then just have to plug these into the corresponding headers on your motherboard. Now, if you can't daisy chain fans together, you can buy these fan splitter cables instead and just plug in all of your fans into it and then plug the end of that into any of your motherboard's fan headers. If you guys want to grab one of these cables, I'll drop a link to it down below. Now, for those who buy a triple fan pack like this one from ASUS, you will most likely get a fan controller in there already, allowing you to easily plug all the fans into the hub itself and then just plug the controller cables into the corresponding motherboard connectors. Do keep in mind, most controllers require additional power, either from SATA, Molex, or in some newer stuff like the Corsair iCUE iLink products, PCI cables are needed to supply power. So make sure to plug the necessary cables in from the power supply. Okay, we are reaching the end of the build guide. You guys are doing exceptionally well. Hang in there. It's time to finish connecting the rest of the power supply cables to your motherboard. We can start off with the EPS cables. So grab the end of the power supply cables that have 8-pin connectors like this and plug it into the EPS connectors on your motherboard, which is usually located on the top left. You can tell which ones are EPS by the seam in the middle. You can split these cables in half if your motherboard has additional 4-pin sockets. You technically don't need to plug in both of the EPS cables if your motherboard has more than one connector. You just need to plug in the first one. The second one will just provide additional power to the CPU socket if you plan on doing any overclocking. If you have the cables for it, I always recommend plugging them in. Make sure the clip sits over the lip and that there is no gap between the connection, otherwise your PC will have trouble booting up. Next, grab the 24-pin ATX cable that looks like this and run it through the closest grommet in the case and plug it into the 24-pin connector, often located on the right side. Again, make sure it's fully seated to avoid booting problems. If you picked up some nice cable extensions, now's the best time to plug them in. Just plug the male into the female connections and plug the extension cable into the motherboard's 24-pin socket. Look how much nicer this looks. Links below if you guys want to pick one up for your build. The last cable left should be the graphics card. In this case, we're just going to grab the end of it and pass it through the closest grommet in the case and pull it out from the front so we can easily plug it in after we install the graphics card. Once again, if you're installing extension cables, go ahead and hook those up now. Before we install the graphics card, this would be the best time to double check all the cables in the back of your PC. There shouldn't be a single loose cable except for the GPU, of course. If you do find one, go ahead and plug it in where it belongs. If you're lost and you don't know where it goes, go back and watch the cable portion of the video again. Okay, if you're installing a vertical GPU bracket, go ahead and take out everything from the box. Otherwise, skip over to the next section of the video. Every case has a different method, but usually you would have to remove the PCI brackets in the back first, slide in the vertical bracket, and screw it in from the side using the case thumb screws. After that, grab the PCI riser cable and install the female slot on the bracket using the included screws. The vertical GPU brackets usually have extra mounting holes, giving you the option of deciding how close you want the GPU to the side panel, so you can adjust this if you want. Then grab the male end of the riser cable and plug it in the top PCI slot of your motherboard. Make sure it's fully seated until the tab clicks in place. Otherwise, you will have issues getting the display from your GPU. Then, to install the graphics card, you would have to remove the amount of PCI brackets in the back that corresponds with the size of the I/O bracket of your GPU. In other words, if your GPU is a 2-slot card, then remove 2 brackets. If it's a 3-slot card, then you would have to remove 3 of them. Proceed to gently slide the GPU inside the female PCI slot until the tab locks in place. Then you can tighten the GPU by screwing in through the PCI bracket in the back. Grab the GPU cable that we fed through the case earlier in the video and plug it into the graphics card. Make sure this is fully seated, otherwise you might have issues getting display from the GPU. Okay, before we install the GPU, this is a good time to install all of your PCI extension cards if you have any. This can be a Wi-Fi adapter, an Elgato capture card, or anything that uses a PCI slot on your motherboard. If your PCI card uses a x4 interface, then it has a very short connector like this one. You can plug these into any of the PCI slots in your motherboard, but if you have any available x4 slots, then I would recommend plugging it in there instead. Trace the slot on the motherboard towards the back of the case and go ahead and remove the PCI bracket that corresponds with that slot. Grabbing the PCI card by its sides, gently insert it in all the way. There is no locking tab here, so just make sure that the card is fully inserted. Finally, it's time to plug in the graphics card. Figure out how many PCI brackets you need to remove from the back of the case in order to fit your GPU. An easy way to figure this out is by holding the GPU against the top PCI slot and seeing how many slots it takes up. Then you can proceed to remove the thumb screws, releasing the brackets. You can store the brackets away safely in the motherboard box or the graphics card box in the event you sell your case or downgrade your GPU. Some budget cases might have snap-off PCI brackets instead. If that's the case, simply push out the bracket from the inside and vice versa from the outside until the bracket gets loose enough where it snaps off. I always recommend installing the GPU on the top PCI slot to take advantage of the extra performance. Hold your GPU firmly with one hand and use your other hand to hold onto the case to prevent it from tipping over. Slowly move the GPU towards the top PCI slot. Both the male PCI interface and the female PCI slot are aligned before you push in the GPU in place. You should hear the locking mechanism snap in place. If it doesn't, apply more force until you do, or until the tab is locked in place. Grab the thumb screws that you removed earlier and use them to secure the GPU in place. And finally, grab the GPU cables that we fed through the case earlier and plug them in. Make sure the clip sits over the notch and that there is no gap between the connection. You did it! You finally finished building your PC. Pat yourself on the back because you deserve it. But we're not done just yet. We still have to finish setting it up. So before we power on your PC, we need to download the Windows operating system on the drive. So use another PC that has access to the internet and plug in the empty USB drive into it. Then visit the Microsoft software download page, which I will link below, and select what operating system you want to install to your PC. I'm installing Windows 11, so I will click on the Windows 11 box. After that, we are going to select the second option to create Windows 11 installation media and download the file. After it's downloaded, go ahead and open it up and follow the on-screen instructions. It will tell you to select your drive. A key thing to note here is that the drive has to be empty before the installation. Otherwise, you will get an error message halfway through the installation. So make sure the drive is formatted installation. This process can take up to 20 minutes depending on your internet speed. So just let it do its thing, and once it's complete, just hit the finish button and eject the USB drive. Okay, now we are ready to power on the PC. So start plugging in all the power cables. Locate the thick power supply cable and plug that into the back of the power supply unit and switch it on. If you have a Wi-Fi extender for your motherboard, go ahead and plug that in as well. If you don't have one, plug in your Wi-Fi adapter instead so we can get access. If your PC is close by to your router, you can also hardwire into it using an Ethernet cable. But do keep in mind, you probably won't be able to connect to the internet this way until we install the drivers. But some high-end motherboards actually let you connect without any drivers. Unfortunately, the only way you can find out is by continuing with the Windows operating system install. Okay, let's hook up your peripherals next and your monitor. Use any of the available USB ports in the back of the motherboard and plug in your mouse and keyboard. Take this time to also plug the Windows installation USB drive into the back of your PC. Take your HDMI or DisplayPort cable from your monitor and plug that into the back of the graphics card. Do not plug this in the back of the motherboard. Make sure it goes in behind the GPU. Hit the power button on your PC and wait for any type of message displayed on your monitor. Usually it's a notification stating that a new CPU is installed. But regardless of what message it is, it will tell you to press a certain key on your keyboard to enter setup or the BIOS. So go ahead and press that key to enter BIOS. If you're not getting any type of display on your monitor, then there is something wrong. Go ahead and skip over to the troubleshooting section of the video, and after you find the fix, come back and continue watching from here. The first thing we're going to do is change the CPU fan speed only if you have your AIO pump plugged into the CPU fan header. If you didn't plug your AIO pump into the CPU fan header, you can skip over to the Windows 11 installation. So go into the fan settings of your BIOS. Usually you can find that option right on the main menu. If you don't, it's usually in the hardware monitor category. But if all else fails, you can always search for it using a magnifying glass. Once you're in here, find the CPU fan option and set the fan speed control to max. This will ensure that your pump is always running at max speed. Once again, only do this if you plugged in your AIO pump cable into the CPU fan header on your motherboard instead of the AIO pump header. Hit F10 to save your changes and restart your PC. As your PC is powering on or restarting, it should automatically detect the USB drive with the Windows installation files, and it will take you to the beginning of the installation process. If your PC doesn't take you to the screen and it kicks you back into the BIOS, then it means it didn't detect the drive. So go ahead and skip over to the troubleshooting section of the video, and once you find the fix, come back and continue watching from here. Simply follow the on-screen prompts to install the operating system onto your PC. On the active Windows prompt, this is where you have to put in your Windows CD key that we picked up from before. If you didn't grab one yet, it's fine. You can do it now or simply skip the section and do it later in the video by clicking on the I don't have a product key. This next section is very important. You have to select the correct operating system that matches the CD key that you purchased or plan to purchase. If you remember, I purchased a Windows 11 Pro key, so I will select the Windows 11 Pro from this menu. If you select a wrong version, you will have issues installing Windows. Go ahead and click on Next, accept the license terms, and on this page, we are going to select the second custom option, which will take us to the page where we can see all of our drives that are installed. So we installed a 2TB M.2 SSD, which is labeled Drive 1, and a secondary 256GB SSD, which is listed as Drive 0. You can also tell which drive is which by looking at the total size. If your drive isn't listed on here, then there's an issue with the connection. Go back and make sure all the cables are plugged in correctly, and if you're still having issues, skip to the troubleshooting section of the video for more help. I always recommend selecting your fastest drive for your operating system. In my case, it's my 2TB M.2 SSD because it has the fastest read and write speeds. So once you select your drive, let Windows do its thing and install the operating system. This process can take a while, so you can leave and grab a snack if you like. After it's done installing Windows, it will restart your PC. So at this point, you can remove the USB drive from the back while it restarts and continues the installation process. Once again, just follow the prompts on your screen until you get to this page where it asks you to connect to a network. If you see an Ethernet option on the screen, then that means your PC can connect to the internet through an Ethernet cable. So plug that into your PC and continue with the setup process. If you don't see any internet options, then you would have to plug in your Wi-Fi adapter that I recommended earlier in the video. Once that's plugged in, you have the option to connect to Wi-Fi. So once you're connected to the internet, continue with the setup process. Your PC might restart a few times during the entire process, which is completely normal. After all the restarts, it should take you to this page where it will continue updating. This process can take a while, up to an hour depending on your internet speed. So after the update and a few restarts later, it will finally take you to the Windows desktop. The first thing we have to do here is download the drivers. Most manufacturers will send you a notification on the bottom right corner as soon as you're connected to the internet, asking you to download their software, which has all the drivers. Since I'm using a Gigabyte motherboard, I will be downloading the Gigabyte Control Center. If you don't get any type of notification here, you can always go into your motherboard's website and download it straight from there. For Aorus and Gigabyte motherboards, it's called Gigabyte Control Center. For MSI, it's called MSI Center. And for Asus, it's called Armoury Crate. I'll drop a link to all of these down below for anyone interested. To be clear, you don't have to download this software to install the drivers. You can also visit the motherboard website and download the drivers from the support section. So in my build, I'm using the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Pro X. So then I would click on the support page, select my model, and then pick and choose what drivers to install. Ideally, these are the drivers you should always install on your PC. The audio driver, the chipset driver, and any additional firmware needed, the LAN drive for your specific operating system, the Bluetooth driver if you want Bluetooth connection, and the Wi-Fi driver is an absolute must. I personally like downloading the entire software because I have access to everything right here in the app. I can also pick and choose what drivers to install, and it will automatically do it without having to open up multiple windows. Also, I can control the RGB lights, adjust the fan speeds, and other useful stuff all in the same app. So it's entirely up to you how you want to install the drivers. So once all the drivers are installed and you restart your PC, it's time to activate Windows. If you haven't already, visit any CDK website you want and purchase a Windows key. I recommend VIP or CDK because they are the cheapest and you get your keys within a minute. Go ahead and search for the Windows operating system you installed on your PC. In my case, it's Windows 11 Pro, but they do sell Windows 10 keys as well. Don't forget to use the code TS20 to get your discount before checking out. Afterwards, click on the User Center option on the bottom, which will take you to your orders page, and then find the key you just purchased and click on the View Keys button to reveal the key. Just simply copy and paste this and tap on the Windows button on your keyboard to open up the search bar. Type in Activate and select the activation settings. Over here we can select Change, so we can change the product key and simply paste the new CD key here and hit Activate and you're done. You now have full access to all of Windows features like changing the theme. If you installed an extra storage device, let's go ahead and activate them. Otherwise you can skip to the next section. Hit the Windows button on your keyboard and type in Disk. Then go ahead and select Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions. This will bring up all your devices that are plugged into your PC. If your drive is missing, go ahead and watch that section of the video again to make sure all the cables are plugged in. And if they are all plugged in, watch the troubleshooting section instead and come back and continue from here. By default, only your primary drive will show up in Windows Explorer. The drives that are not activated are labeled unallocated, and it will usually have a black border like you see here. We're going to click on the unallocated drive and select New Simple Volume, and just follow the prompts on the screen. Over here you can assign a drive letter if you want, and on the next few pages you can change the volume name if you desire. Once you're done and hit the finish button, the black bar will turn blue and the drive should show up. Let's take this time to change a few settings of Windows. First thing we have to do is set your refresh rate of the monitor. By default, this is set to 60 Hz out of the box, especially if you have a fresh install of Windows. Right click on the desktop and click on Display. Then scroll down and select Advanced Display. Make sure you set the highest refresh rate possible for your monitor and just hit Accept Changes. Let's also adjust the power plan and a few other taskbar settings. So go ahead and right click the taskbar and go into the taskbar settings. Disable the annoying search bar and remove any of the features you don't plan on using. Hit the Windows button again and type in Power Plan and select Choose a Power Plan. Make sure to set this at high performance, or in some cases, if you have the ultimate performance, select that instead. We can use this time to install our GPU drivers. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you're going to download and install GeForce Experience, which I'll link down below. Once you open the app, it will automatically download the correct drivers for you. If you have an AMD CPU or GPU, then you will need to download the AMD Radeon software instead. Once again, I will leave a link to it down below. But once you're here, just click on the Download Drivers button for whatever operating system you are using, and once you open the program, it will do the rest. Okay, now it's time to enable XMP to make sure your RAM is running at its max speed, which will improve your frame rates in games. Restart your PC and hit the delete key repeatedly until you get into the BIOS. Once you're into the BIOS, we're going to switch to the advanced menu, find the tweaker tab, which is sometimes called overclocking. Scroll down until we find the extreme memory profile option, or XMP for short, and we're simply going to just enable it. This will overclock your memory to its default frequency. So in my case, it is set to 6400 MHz. Then we're going to hit F10 to save changes and go back to the desktop. Let's go ahead and confirm this by right-clicking on the taskbar, going into the Task Manager settings, then click on the Performance tab and select Memory. You should see the current speed of your memory on the bottom right side. If it matches the frequency of your XMP, then it was successful. If your PC is having issues rebooting or you don't have any display output to your monitor, skip to the troubleshooting section in this video. However, if your PC does boot but ends up crashing on idle or while you're gaming after enabling XMP, then it means your memory is not on the QVL of your motherboard, meaning it's not compatible and you might experience some instabilities. If this happens, you need to go back into the BIOS and underclock the memory by 100 MHz. So for example, we are currently set to 6400 MHz on our memory. I'm going to simply go down to 6300 MHz instead. Then I'm going to save changes and reboot. I'm going to repeat this process until my PC doesn't crash and it's stable while gaming. If you can play a full game without your system crashing, then you are pretty much in the clear. But if your system keeps crashing no matter what frequency you set the memory at, then it's best that you keep the XMP disabled in the BIOS and try again with another pair of memory sticks later in the future. And finally, if you want to add a few extra frames to your games and have Windows run buttery smooth, let's go and optimize it. First thing we're going to do is hit the Windows button and type in Game Bar to bring up the Xbox Game Bar. This is notorious for eating up resources in the background. Make sure to disable this. Speaking of Game Bar, let's go back into the previous window by clicking on Gaming and make sure all of these options are set to off so that Windows doesn't eat up any resources. Go back into the Task Manager and select Startup Apps. We are going to disable all the apps you don't want Windows to load when you first boot your PC, as this takes up additional resources. Obviously, this is a new PC, so the list will be extremely short, but do remind yourself to do this after a few months once you start downloading a bunch of programs, because by default, Windows will load them every time you boot. Next, hit the Windows button on your keyboard again and type in msconfig to bring up the system configuration. Navigate to the Services tab and hide all of the Microsoft services. Then go ahead and select which services you don't want Windows to run in the background. Again, this list might be very small because you just built a new PC, so just remind yourself to come back here in a few months. You can always bookmark this video as a reminder. If you don't use OneDrive, I strongly recommend you to unlink it from your PC. Click on the OneDrive icon on the lower right side and click on the Settings button. Then go into the settings. Simply click on so that OneDrive will stop running in the background. Game mode has been proven to increase your FPS in some games, and I highly recommend enabling this feature. Hit the Windows button and type in Game mode, and go into the Game mode settings and enable Game mode. Alright, now you're officially done building your very first PC. It's running buttery smooth and it looks spectacular. Go ahead and celebrate by peeling off the protective plastic. If this build guide was at all helpful to you guys, consider tossing a like before you head out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys very soon in the next one. Well, it seems like you're one of the few unfortunate people to reach this part of the video, but don't worry, we're gonna get your PC up and running in no time. Let's start with the issue of no screen when you first hit the power button. All of your lights are on, the fans are spinning, but you get no display to your monitor. Start by double checking the cables plugged in the back of your PC and your monitor. Make sure the HDMI or DisplayPort cables are fully seated. Try a different cable. If you're using an HDMI, switch to a DisplayPort cable or vice versa. I've had many instances in the past where I would get no display to my monitor using an HDMI cable, and when I switched over to a DisplayPort cable, it automatically worked for some reason. Most monitors automatically detect which port you are using and will switch to that port, but if yours doesn't, manually switch the inputs using the OSD menu. Let's check the cables inside of your PC. We gotta make sure all the important cables are plugged in, from the GPU, the motherboard's 24-pin cable, and the EPS connectors up top. If it's not fully seated, you might have issues getting displayed. If your power supply is fully modular, make sure the other end of the cables are plugged in all the way. This might be a little tough to do now since the power supply is already installed, but if you can somehow reach the cables, double check them. Let's do a quick power drain. Turn off your PC by pressing or holding down the power button. Remove the power supply cable from the back and press and hold the power button until you hear the system click or until the lights go out. We are draining the static power from the PC, which is kind of like a slap in the face for the PC to get its shit together and have a fresh boot. Plug the power supply cable in and power on the system. If that doesn't do anything, let's try reseating the RAM. Power off your PC and simply remove all of your memory sticks and reinstall them. Then power on your PC again. We can also take this time to test each individual stick separately. So install one memory stick back inside the motherboard and do the exact same test. Rinse and repeat for the other stick as well. Resetting the CMOS usually fixes most problems. On most high-end boards, you will have a clear CMOS button on the back of the motherboard. While your PC is powered off, click on the clear CMOS button. Try powering the PC on again. If your motherboard doesn't have a CMOS button, then you have to reset it manually. Every motherboard has a circular CMOS battery often located near the bottom half of the board. In some motherboards, it might be located underneath a heat shield. Just simply use your fingernail to press down on the tab to pop out the battery. Leave it off for about 2 minutes before putting it back in and powering back on your PC. If you're using a riser cable because you mounted your GPU vertically, make sure the riser cable is the correct gen. If you're using a 3rd gen motherboard and graphics card, you need to use a Gen 3 riser cable. But if you're using a Gen 4 card and motherboard, then you will need a Gen 4 riser cable instead. Okay, at this point there's something wrong with your hardware or your BIOS version. Maybe you installed a newer CPU on an older motherboard and it doesn't support it. In this case, I recommend doing a BIOS flash to get your motherboard updated to the most recent version. You can find the BIOS file on your motherboard's website underneath the support tab and the BIOS section. Download the BIOS file onto any empty flash drive and plug the flash drive into the USB port in the back of your motherboard labeled specifically for the BIOS flash. Make sure your PC is powered off, but the power supply switch is set to on. Then simply hit the flash button in the back of your motherboard. The light should blink, indicating that it's in the process of updating the BIOS. Do not remove the USB drive until the light either goes out or stops blinking. This should fix your issue. If it doesn't, gently grab your PC and chuck it out the window and start over. I'm kidding. There's probably a hardware issue with your PC, especially if you didn't test the components outside of the case like I recommended earlier in the video. If that's the case, I strongly recommend watching my troubleshooting video, which I will link below. I go more in depth on the testing process to figure out what the issue is. Okay, so your PC is now recognizing the USB drive that you plugged in the back of the motherboard, and it's constantly kicking you back to the BIOS. The first thing I would do is try a different port in the back. If that doesn't work, restart your PC and hit the boot menu button on your keyboard. It varies on all motherboards. On Aorus boards, for example, it's F12. So once you get into the boot menu, you can manually select which drive you want to boot from. And you should see something that says Windows Boot Manager. Go ahead and select that drive and hit the Enter key on your keyboard, and it will take you to the Windows installation page. If your drive doesn't show up, then you most likely download the files incorrectly or the drive is corrupt. I would format it and re-download the Windows files again. If your storage drive doesn't show up on the partitions page, then I would double check and make sure all the cables are plugged in. And if that doesn't help, I would try a different SATA port on your motherboard. Some ports are disabled when you use the top M.2 SSD slot. So in this case, I would try any of the bottom ones. I hope this build guide was helpful to some of you. If it was, maybe consider tossing a like, as it took me a full month to get this up and running. If you guys need more help with your system, consider joining my Discord server using my link down below and post your problem in the tech support channel. Either myself or someone more knowledgeable will reach out and help you guys out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon in the next one.
Okay, I think we should be live. Let me know if you can hear and see everything okay. We're going to be doing some 3090 overclocking today, including the reference card with liquid nitrogen. Actually, I'm not really going to be overclocking this one as much as I am just determining the frequency behavior of the card. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's not part of the RIP-J challenge or anything. That's just for separate research. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Then we'll do some overclocking on air. So let's see what's chat saying. Looks fine, can hear fine. Okay, cool, thank you. Okay, let me tweet this out and then we'll get going. So yeah, we're gonna be doing some 3090 work today. Let's see. We are live with the RTX 3090s and some overclocking stream. All right, cool. Yeah, so like I said, plan today is to work on the 3090s. The couple of things specifically, people are asking about, like, me to talk about the capacitor thing that Igor and Jay have been talking about. I haven't looked into it yet. I've been slammed with reviewing stuff, so I don't really have a count yet because I haven't looked into the capacitor stuff. Are you restocking the wireframe mousepad? Yes, actually. So I just had our warehouse guy go through the inventory and get a count on it. We've got a couple more that we added in stock. The next big shipment is a little ways out, but not too far. But there are some in there right now that are on the store already that are in stock and shipping. Not a huge amount, but enough to probably get through the stream. We'll see. No, I have not watched the videos on the capacitor stuff. I do know a little bit about it, but I'm going to keep my mouth shut until I can do more research because I don't want to put bad information out there. So, like, I know a little bit. I've spoken to some partners, but I haven't read Igor's content, and I'm not really sure what exactly is true and what's not, so I'm not going to say anything right now. We'll look into that later, though. But not this weekend, because we've already got a bunch of stuff lined up. All right, so what I want to do is use some liquid nitrogen to test how the 3090 behaves at different frequencies. This is really useful because what we can do is specifically control the GPU temperature such that it's not like liquid nitrogen just automatically makes it extreme and unattainable levels of cooling. It depends on how much we pour in there. So my plan is to pour in amounts so that we can say start at maybe 80 degrees Celsius, and then we'll step down to like 75, 70, 60, and I want to look at how much the frequency is changing. Okay, how much the frequency is changing at each increment of temperature, and that'll allow us to see like how much your normal cooling matters. So even though we're using LN2 to do this experiment, to do this research, in reality what you can take away is if you have a cooler that is 5 degrees lower than the next one, which is definitely possible on air between all the cards out there. Actually, with the FE versus like the Gigabyte Eagle, it's 10 degree difference noise normalized. Or if you have water, you might be talking 10, 15 degrees cooler, maybe 20 if you're going from a Founders Edition. So this will help us show that sense of extra frequency you get just out of the boosting behavior alone. So there's a lot of questions about AIB cards, capacitors, stuff like that. So AIB cards, we're working on reviews of the 3080s. Just shot the first one, actually. That's almost done being edited. That'll go up in the next week or so. So we're working on those. Okay, so when are you going to activate channel memberships? No current plans. Patreon is enough to keep up with as is. I need to put a thermocouple on here, actually. I forgot to put one into the LN2 pot when I assembled this. So we're just going to go ahead and do that live. So it has to be done anyway. And then we'll move on to the air-cooled card overclocking after that. But this is what I'm most interested with starting on. So let's, we're gonna have to take this off. This is insulation, this is a Founders Edition card. I'm gonna keep an eye on super chats, but I'm gonna be reading them on probably about a 30 to 60 minute delay. And all this stuff on the board is just Vaseline for insulation because it's gonna get cold. So that's helpful for that later. No, Joe went back home. Joe doesn't live nearby, so Joe's back home. He wants to do some 3090 stuff soon once he gets it. Okay. Yes, someone in chat saying he knows about the capacitor theory. Stop asking. Yeah, like I said, I've heard of it, a couple thoughts, but I don't have anything to publish yet because, you know, I try not to talk about things until I've studied them, and that's some of the others have looked into it, but I have not had time really to go look into it as much as I'd like. So probably just stick with what other people have said for now, and we'll look into it when we get a chance. I know that one of the main issues, though, is a vacuum outside. One of the main issues is the frequency boosting over 2,000 megahertz in some applications like Heaven, but yeah, that's something we'll talk about later. So I need to put thermocouple in the liquid nitrogen pot, and we're gonna need some I guess I have a tube, some thermal paste for that. So I've got Vaseline everywhere from this card now. Vaseline is to insulate. Actually, we need a screwdriver also. Does this fit that screw? No. Did you watch Jay's video? No. I don't. I'm like busy making our own every day. I don't have infinite time. It takes me a while to get to that stuff. I just shot like 2 or 3 videos in the last 12 hours. Okay, so this is the bracket for the 30 series. Like I said, we're going to get to some air-cooled overclocking on the FTW3 in a bit, which is also on the table to my right. And then we're going to start with this one for frequency scale. Okay, so we need to clean that off anyway. Might as well do that right now. And then after that, we will do the thermocouple installation, which goes in underneath the bracket so that it can stay in securely. And we're going to put some more thermal paste in for the chamber where the couple goes. So let me clean off the card. This is the FE, if not obvious already from the sort of like fractured looking design. That is intentional, but it is definitely a unique approach to design. In our review that's coming up of one of the partner models for the 3080s, we show how the partner cards are still advantaged in several ways over FE. Despite improvements generationally, NVIDIA is still behind where partners are, but that's not too surprising. They've gotten a lot better, but they're still not yet the best. Somewhat far from it, depending on what benchmarks. Okay. So, thermocouple holes over here. What I'm going to do is get some paste. I've seen some comments about the capacitor stuff. I think some have really taken away the wrong thing from this story. But, okay. So we're going to go with some paste right there. This, just obvious as paste always does, helps conduct. So the real goal here is to make sure that the reading from the thermocouple is accurate as much as it can be to the Allen 2 pot. So that'll go in there. And now we can put the bracket back on, which has a specific installation. I don't think I can really cover that rubber band like I'd like to. Yeah. Maybe that will work. I think that I don't really want to run that rubber band against the GPU, so let's put that underneath. Okay, I'm not going to answer the question about capacitors anymore because I've answered it like 4 times now. So you can rewind in the DVR if you want to see that. Alright. Have you heard anything interesting from AMD lately? No, not anything that's like useful in terms of product. I don't actually know any more than any of you do right now. Not much more anyway, a little bit, but most of it is not product level stuff. It's more like supply level stuff. So, no, I don't know too much about what AMD's got going on at the moment. These you don't want to over tighten. I've snapped screws in here before, specifically this top left one. So Always be careful not to go too tight. Okay. All right, so gotta clean that off, and now we can get some KP paste on there. So today we're using KPX, this, and Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut for anything LN2 related. I'll start looking at the super chats in a bit. If you want to pick up the shirt that I am wearing, they are on store.gamersnexus.net. We're expecting to run out of quantity in probably about the next 7 days or so, if not sooner. And all of that, obviously, like everything else, goes straight back into funding the testing and the work we do here. But if you want a cool shirt for 1 million subs, it is on the store. Okay, we should be good here. So now, I'm just gonna put the card back on. Getting a good mount on this is really important. It helps to sort of take turns tightening the screws. Let's drop that down like that. I'm gonna press on it just a little bit to get some sticking, and then we will tighten the screws back on. Let's see. I think someone asked about Windows. I didn't catch the whole question, but if it helps, I think the question was about stripping Windows down. I'm not sure if I read it fast enough before it scrolled up. I did some custom work on Windows for this particular build. It's pretty stripped down, and I've got a lot of services disabled, stuff like that, to help with overclocking performance, but we are not going to get a super competitive score today, because the real overclock effort I'm going to be doing is on the FTW3 with Air, and then this one is just going to be like for frequency research stuff I need to do anyway. I figured I'd do it on the stream. Let's see if that's a good way to check the mount quality, is to get eye level with it and look through to see if the gaps on the sides of the die are even, or if you have a gap where the die is, and we're good there. So now I just need to put this insulation back on. Should probably put some more VAS on there, but I'm just gonna, oh, that's kind of dry. Let's do a little more. This brush is not particularly useful at this point. Okay, so this again is insulation. Helps protect against once the condensation dries. Or once the condensation thaws, and helps any water droplets that run off should not be touching anything that'll cause a short. I don't typically kill a card from a short, but it's possible. I normally just have a worse time overclocking. Okay, someone asked, is the paste worth overclocking? Man, I'm like misspeaking a lot right now. Is the paste worth overclocking? Yes, overclock your thermal paste. Is the paste worth replacing for an overclock, was the question. I think it is for an overclock. For like stock performance, about the thermal paste that's on cards, but over time, it will definitely age worse than a lot of the aftermarket pastes out there. You could replace it later or earlier, it doesn't particularly matter, but at some point later down the line, especially if you buy a card used, it might be worth replacing it. For overclocking, for liquid nitrogen especially, it's absolutely, you should replace it, because, I mean, obviously you're doing it anyway because you're taking the board apart, but should replace it with LN2 specifically because of the fact that you're going to be dealing with low temperatures that can cause the paste to crack. Where'd that get? Can you grab wherever that is for me? So I'm going to plug this into a thermocouple reader, and we'll try and put that on the right side so it's visible during benchmarking today. Although, might not be able to get it, but we'll try. Well, maybe over here. Nope, let's do that for now. Okay, so, yeah, we're going to do the LN2 stuff first for frequency research, like I said, if you're just tuning in. So specifically the goal here is to determine how the card behaves with temperatures from 80 degrees down to negatives. This will be extrapolated. You can extrapolate this to liquid coolers, to let's see, water coolers, chilled, anything, because the liquid nitrogen itself doesn't matter. It's the temperature of the GPU that matters. So that's what we're going to be showing. Let's get this over here. And I need a mouse and keyboard. So we're going to show off the frequency scale, and that will help you understand other benefits like noise, for example, you might get from water cooling or from a better air cooler. Are there any frequency or performance in terms of gaming benefits that you can gain? If you don't know, if you're not aware, GPU Boost will boost the clocks based on the temperature. And that's why our goal is to determine the extent of that boosting today. I don't know if they're on 5.0 yet, or if they're still on GPU Boost 4.0, but USB, okay. Wow, that might be a world record for plugging in USB blind. All right, let's see if we can boot. This I don't think I can do blind. I might need your help on that one. Okay, I give up. Maybe Andrew can do it. Let me get some super chats while Andrew gets that for me. Okay, viewer activity. So, Philip Zeiser said, "Hi, Steve." Hi. Absolute said, "What are your thoughts on AIB cards cheaping out on capacitors, causing numerous issues with new GPUs?" I said this already, but I haven't fully looked into it yet, so I don't have any thoughts on it. I try not to talk about that stuff until I actually read into it, because someone's gonna be like, "Oh, shade at Jay." No, Jay read about it. I haven't. That's the difference. So, Daniel Silva says, "Congrats on 1 million. Good luck with the 3090. Thank you." Let's see. John Macy, message retracted. Frusignu 2011 said, "Hey Steve, I switched to an IT career because of your channel. I hear the overclocking 3090 overclock on an air yield 7% gains from stock. Is it true? We'll find out tonight." And IT career, IT is such a wide net to cast, but I wish you luck in whatever aspect it is. It's I think it's a good industry to be in. It's pretty stable in growth, especially, well, actually right now it's going up in growth because of the work from home stuff. People, suddenly you've got people who've never done really much of online anything before having to use it for daily tasks. So it's a good time to switch. Okay, let's see. I think we should be able to boot. So this card is interesting for its layout. The VRM is really close to the GPU. I'm hoping that, nice, it's a high RPM fan. I'm hoping that because it's so close to the GPU, the liquid nitrogen helps us a little bit with the cooling. So I don't have to have these fans here, hopefully, but we'll see how it goes. That's just for the VRM mostly. Sound like a bandsaw or something. So yeah, this is not going to be for a record-setting score, this setup. Oh, we're missing the power cable on this monitor. It's like a power brick plugged into the power strip down there. And it should be a barrel plug if you can grab that. I'm gonna fill up some LN2 while we get the monitor plugged in. So yeah, LN2 stuff is gonna be for frequency. I keep saying this, but we have a lot of people still joining. I'll stop saying it's kind of full. And the actual overclock is gonna be on the EVGA FTW3. What is this? Okay. So let me rotate this. Is there anything? Although we should be able to, even just on air, I think, beat our scores we set with Joe previously. But officially, I'm not going to be posting a score past Jay's right now because he was on chilled intake with an air conditioner. And I'm going to be on just the air cooler ambient. So this will be for the free